Just tell me when.
Cool. So we're live now. Hey everyone. We have
Oh,
Evan,
okay.
CEO and co-founder of Ampleforth. He'll be doing a talk on cryptoeconomics, exploring monetary lens for how to think about cryptocurrencies. Once he starts talking, can you guys confirm in the chat that you can hear him?
Hey everyone, glad to be here and thanks for having me. My name's Evan. Can you all hear me? I can't actually see the chat window, so I'm gonna have to.
Yep, they can hear you.
Cool. Yeah. So my name's Evan. I'm one of the co-founders of Ampleforth, and we have a cryptocurrency called Ample, which it's like Bitcoin in that it's a cryptocurrency, but it has an elastic supply policy that automatically increases or decreases the quantity of tokens in user wallets based on nominal exchange rate. My background originally was in engineering, so I studied mechanical engineering as well as computer science at UC Berkeley. But we were fortunate enough in the case of this project to be advised by a couple members of Stanford's Hoover Institute, including Neil Ferguson. And they were generous enough to give us a really kind of, hard lesson in monetary economics, which we eventually realized was really valuable in general to the application of cryptocurrencies today, in particular for understanding, what problems they can solve and what problems they can't solve and what problems even exist to be solved. And I'm here today to kind of share a little bit of what I've learned in my journey with everyone in the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to move forward with the next slide. So yeah, I'll just go ahead and open by saying that not everything being explored in crypto is new. It's a new technology, certainly, but some of the things that people are experimenting with are new and important. Some are kind of old and very well understood, and many of the things that we're kind of playing with nowadays are neither here nor there. And our goal today is to provide an overview of basic monetary economic concepts such that we can better differentiate between what's new and important and what's old and very well understood. But before I jump into the details of it, I kind of want to frame with a definition of cryptocurrencies and DeFi that I think has been really helpful in my case for communicating with people who don't have a great deal of background in macroeconomics. And, I always kind of just tend to encourage people to think of cryptocurrencies as a new generation of digital precious metals, with Bitcoin being the obvious example of a digital gold. And I also encourage people to think of DeFi as a new generation of digital banks designed to kind of exchange, store, lend, and borrow these new precious metals. And one of the main distinctions between a precious metal like gold and a bank is that a bank has a balance sheet of assets and liabilities, right? You can deposit assets into it, you can withdraw assets from it, and it maintains this ledger of who owes what. Whereas a precious metal doesn't have a notion of assets and liabilities. Like gold doesn't owe anyone anything, right? You just have a certain number of units of gold, and it has these media of exchange properties that make it convenient for kind of transferring, to and from, right? And Bitcoin and a lot of these cryptocurrencies, at least the pure monetary cryptocurrencies, are this way as well. So again, think of cryptocurrencies for the purpose of this presentation as a new generation of digital precious metals, and think of DeFi as a new generation of digital banks. So I'm kind of just going to power through a bunch of these concepts that, for anybody who's studied economics or macroeconomics will be totally review. But for a lot of us who came from a technology background and didn't really do a lot of heavy reading in macroeconomics, might be new. And one is the concept of rules versus discretion. And this is kind of a dichotomy, right, between rules-based monetary policies and discretionary monetary policies that was originally introduced in 1936 by Henry Simmons in a paper called Rules versus Authorities in Monetary Policy. And it's still heavily debated today whether one is better than another. It's kind of just, there's a tension to it. But it begins with a simple definition, a discretionary framework is one in which policymakers have a great deal of latitude in their ability to adjust and respond to circumstances. And an example of this would be like the U.S. dollar, right? If the economy is in a jam, the powers that be can convene and decide, right, to stimulate the economy against the kind of natural forces of markets. And this has gotten us out of a lot of jams. And so this is what, I mean, eventually Kydland and Prescott would describe as a time inconsistent policy, meaning, you have these frameworks, you have these preferences, but you can kind of adjust the rules over time. And as you probably know, the Fed has specific mandates, right? Maintain, a certain type of employment, right? Maintain moderate long-term interest rates and try to prevent, price inflation from getting crazy. Those are kind of their guideposts, but really they have the ability to kind of change their rules at their discretion. And, for those of you who are deeper into crypto, MakerDAO might be an example of such a system, except for rather than having a centralized authority decide, the rules of the system, they kind of cede that to a community governance system. But either way, it's a discretionary framework. And in contrast, you have this concept of a rules-based framework in which these policy responses follow a pre-specified plan that doesn't really change. And this is what Kydland and Prescott would describe as time consistent. And Bitcoin is a really good example of a rules-based framework. It has an absolute supply policy, a fixed supply policy. There's going to be 21 million Bitcoin, and there isn't really anyone who can change the supply of Bitcoin, not easily. You would have to fork, right? So in that sense, there isn't much to debate. It acts the way it acts, and that policy is consistent over time. And really kind of the tension between a rules-based system and a discretionary system is, you might have heard, the phrase moral hazard. People on TV are always complaining, isn't that a moral hazard? The canonical example of this is that of a floodplain, right? So you can imagine there's a scenario, right, where policymakers don't want anybody to build homes in these floodplains. And to discourage people from building homes there, they pretty much announced that anybody that gets wiped out by a flood is on their own. No disaster relief will be forthcoming ever, right? They make a very clear statement of this. Of course, some people ignore these warnings and decide to build on the floodplain anyways. Then a rain season comes, right? Water rises, the homes get flooded. The media carries a heart-wrenching kind of campaign with footage of rooftops and rolling currents. And, eventually policymakers kind of decide this isn't okay and announce a bailout in which 100% of damages are compensated by the policymakers, right? This is an example of a result that kind of offers the worst of both worlds, right? Homes were destroyed, right? People built on the floodplains. That was really bad, right? And then the victims who ignored the warnings are kind of bailed out by taxpayer funds. This is just hypothetical scenario. One proposal for avoiding this kind of trap is by kind of having a rules-based framework, in which case, like, under no circumstances can anybody be bailed out. In which case, like, people would be wiped out by the floods, but in the future they would choose not to build on the floodplains, right? Because there was no option of ever bailing this out. And so, really that's the dichotomy, right? People say, look, we need this discretionary system to bail the world out, and others say, like, well, if you keep bailing them out, then it's going to become this game of like, when will they bail us out, not like if they will bail us out, and that doesn't result in optimal kind of objectives being met. But right now, these discretionary currencies in the form of fiat work very well. It's the best that we've ever had. I think, as far as I can tell, their only shortcomings come from an ever-present risk of hyperinflation, though that has not really kind of reared its head in the past couple of decades. It is a possibility. And perhaps a kind of more importantly, this predisposition to boom and bust cycles. So these are kind of the two well-known issues with these discretionary systems: risk of hyperinflation and boom bust cycles. So the next concept I'd like to cover is inside monies versus outside monies. So this was introduced in 1960 by Gurley and Shaw in a paper titled Money and a Theory of Finance. I think what they were looking for is a combined theory of money and banking. I mentioned earlier that kind of banks have these balance sheets of assets and liabilities, whereas monies don't have these balance sheets, right? Like gold doesn't have this balance sheet. And for example, the piece of paper, right, that you call a dollar, it itself does not contain a balance sheet. But there's a great deal of money in circulation that is kind of an inside money that represents debt, right? For example, all the kind of debt creation that happens based on reserve ratios by commercial banks, right? And we use these kind of circulating IOUs, this debt-based money, and kind of the paper money, right, which doesn't represent a balance sheet of assets and liabilities interchangeably, which is why it was important to create this combined theory of kind of money and banking. And so Gurley and Shaw decided to kind of classify these things into inside monies and outside monies. And inside monies are kind of have a net zero balance within this sector of the economy, whereas outside monies are kind of always a net positive in a sector of an economy. And so, this is again just me trying to explain some of the benefits and drawbacks of either. No one is necessarily universally better than the other, but these inside monies that are debt based naturally carry a risk of default, right? So say there's a run on the banks, there's not enough in collateral, or there's a debt marketplace, and there's kind of a liquidity crisis, and things can no longer be sold. There's a risk of default, and that's why inside monies require powerful central authorities who are capable of bailing out markets in order to be effective. The US dollar is an example of this. Whereas outside monies, they don't represent debt, right? They're things like commodity monies like gold and silver, um, or just the kind of the paper money component of the US dollar system, right? Like I said, some of it represents kind of a credit debt relationship, but some of it just is a fixed stock of paper. The paper portion of that is also considered an outside money. And these outside monies are valuable in a world of imperfect information and imperfect trust, where you don't want to require constant enforcement. And they, again, always represent a net positive balance. And so Bitcoin is an example of an outside money. The next concept I want to cover here is Robert Triffin's dilemma. So this is kind of a long-standing paradox or dilemma. I think he kind of brought it up prior to Bretton Woods, but today it kind of exists as the conflict of interest that arises when a country's currency is also used as a global reserve currency. And that conflict is inherently a tension between near-term domestic interests and long-term international interests. And this is kind of just an unsolved problem, right? So a clear example of this today is, we've seen kind of the global economy and emerging markets grow faster than the US economy, right? And because the dollar is the global reserve currency, there's a greater amount of demand for dollars than there is supply of dollars. And this kind of allows, the US to rely on easy credit in normal times because there's always more demand than supply, or you can always borrow. And it also allows us to kind of engage in highly expansionary macroeconomic policies in times of crisis, like a lot of money printing, a lot of money creation. And really, like, this is maybe a necessary evil, I guess. There's kind of this Keynes-Hayek debate in general where, somebody says, we can focus only on demand. That's Keynes, right? Don't worry about supply. And as a result, if you stimulate enough demand, you can get yourself out of jam. And really, kind of the tension comes from the fact that this kind of results in asset price inflation, right? So you inject a bunch of money, you supply the global economy with a great deal of money, which puts pressure on you to kind of lend to your domestic economy, right? Which creates these asset price inflations. It's kind of like anytime you do something that benefits the global economy, you kind of hurt the local economy. And anytime you do something that benefits the country's economy, you kind of hurt the global economy. And it's just ever present tension. But the output of it seems to be, risk of boom and bust cycles, which, are dangerous, especially as the global economy gets more and more interconnected, right? So if all asset values and all labor demand kind of goes up and down in lockstep, then when you're at the tail end of a boom and you start to bust and the economy slows down, that results in a great deal of dislocations. People lose their jobs. They kind of have to reconfigure their lives. Entire generations get displaced by these sorts of things. And if the global economy continues to be extremely interconnected, there really isn't a great deal of refuge from it. And this is interesting because one of the great benefits of assets like Bitcoin is it's not as directly connected to traditional indicators of consumption and production as other assets. And so it can be used as kind of a check against these boom bust cycles. The next concept I want to introduce is that of synthetic commodity money. So this was introduced in 2015 by an economist at the Cato Institute named George Selgin. And what it is it's a classification of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. It's a formal classification. And so I think he approached it very simply. He looked at existing frameworks, looked at money through the lens of scarcity and use value, a very common way of looking at monies for macroeconomists. And he observed that Bitcoin didn't really fit in any of the aforementioned categories. It was similar to fiat in that it has no non-monetary utility. You can't eat it, right? You can't build your home out of it. You can't really consume it for any utility value. Yet it resembled commodity monies in that it was absolutely scarce, or it has this rule-bound scarcity. So it's similar to gold in that there's only so much of it on the planet. And noting that it required a classification of its own, he decided to call it a synthetic commodity money. But more importantly, he went on to kind of investigate like how this might be useful, or not, if not Bitcoin, how synthetic commodity monies in general might be useful for the purpose of monetary reform. And he kind of listed out some advantages, right? So gold is disadvantaged in that it has a very high cost of production, which is why it's not a very elastic currency. It responds to marginal changes in demand, right? So if there's more demand for gold, it might appear cheaper to kind of mine gold as we deploy more funds to the labor effort of mining gold. And as a result, the supply of gold increases. And when there's less demand, you would halt those efforts because it would appear very expensive. But ultimately, gold is not very elastic in that it does have a fixed supply, and it's extremely expensive to unearth or destroy. And like fiat, Bitcoin is free from the inherent cost disadvantage of digging some piece of metal out of the ground, right? So one of the great benefits of fiat is like following the Industrial Revolution, it became cost effective to print paper monies that were nonetheless very expensive to counterfeit. And that's what made it possible for us to kind of introduce paper money with high elasticity. And similarly, Bitcoin isn't inherently expensive to unearth. Now, or assets like Bitcoin, synthetic commodity monies, aren't inherently expensive. It was determined by the proof of work protocol that it would cost a certain amount of money, but that isn't necessarily the case. The other advantage is that it's free from random supply distortions stemming from technological innovations. So imagine you have a gold mine, but then all of a sudden there's a new generation of technology that allows you to unearth gold at a much more rapid rate, or kind of use imaging technology to increase the likelihood of being able to find gold. Or in the case of oil and other commodities, you see fracking and other technologies that can suddenly increase supply. These supply distortions are not really desirable qualities of pure monies, right? So it might be an innovation in that we can get what we want out of the earth more quickly or cheaply, but it's not great from a monetary policy perspective because it just adds to random kind of supply shocks. And lastly, it has the advantage of not having any non-monetary use. And this is one thing that often folks, like, I guess, who are technical or new to Bitcoin ask me. It's like, okay, well, you can't, what is it worth? It's not backed by anything, or I can't consume it or build a house out of it. And I was going to say to them, that's kind of a feature, not a bug, right? having non-monetary utility is not advantageous through the lens of money. Like, for example, the US dollar would not be a better money if we could eat it or build our homes out of it. That would simply make it harder to regulate its supply. So, I mean, we want these monies to be free from price distortions from utility demand. And Bitcoin has that quality, and synthetic commodity monies in general would have that quality as well. And finally, it's free from politically motivated changes. Like I said, it's a rules-based policy. Nobody can really change it, and therefore there would be no politicking around the modification of something like Bitcoin supply policy. I again kind of harken back to the rule-based, description. It's kind of like playing tennis against a wall versus playing tennis against an actual human partner. If you're playing tennis against a human partner, there's all sorts of mind games, right? What did he do last time? What will he do next time? What did she do last time? What will she do next time? What are her strengths? What are his weaknesses? So on and so forth. If you're playing tennis against the wall, you know that it just bounces the ball back. There's no winning. There's no losing. You'll just understand the constraints of the wall and kind of move around it and know that it's there, and rely on it. And again, in cases like that, there just is there are no politics to speak of. So, I mean, to kind of summarize and maybe try to introduce more kind of relevant, outcomes from this research, we do know a couple things, right? What's old? Banks. We've always been able to create banks, right? Or not always, since the Medici era. We've been able to create banks for a very long time. That's not, what's being enabled by distributed ledger technology or Ethereum or the Bitcoin protocol, right? What else is old? Debt-based monies, right? We already have very high functioning debt-based monies. And we also know that they always require strong central authorities to sustainably function because they occasionally require bailouts. That's the problem of debt-based monies, and that's the benefit of debt-based monies. And so when folks are out there in the cryptocurrency space and recreating sovereign debt money on a blockchain without any sovereign authority, I kind of look upon that and say, like, well, first of all, we already have that. We already know the limitations of that. So, are we really answering any new questions or doing something new? That would be an example of something new or something perceived as new that's actually really old and well understood. All right, but what really is new here is this newfound ability to create commodity monies, right? We weren't able to create gold before Bitcoin, right? Isaac Newton was famously obsessed with alchemy. He would have been impressed, I think, by the Bitcoin protocol and its innovation. We weren't able to create scarcity in a purely digital context prior to Bitcoin. And so I think it's very clear from that perspective, right, that the ability to create a commodity money in a purely digital context is what's new. Now, we also know that a fixed supply commodity money, there's been a great deal of research into commodity reserve standards. Like, we've used things like that, like gold and silver, to build financial ecosystems in the past, and they haven't worked out because these fixed supply assets, they are vulnerable to things like deflationary spirals, like we saw under Bretton Woods, right? So the only problem with things like gold arises when you start to use it as a building block, as part of a broader financial ecosystem. And there's no reason to believe that Bitcoin would be any different. So the idea of things like Seyfedin Amos's Bitcoin standard, I think, is generally viewed to be flawed in its articulation today, at least within the Bitcoin community. The idea that Bitcoin will become this new standard upon which we'll build a robust and long-lasting financial ecosystem in and of itself seems misplaced. Now, that doesn't mean that Bitcoin isn't really valuable. And so this is kind of where I get back to that idea of, like, thinking about cryptocurrencies as a new generation of precious metals. The virtue of that, right, rather than a new generation of, like, US dollars, right, thinking about it as a new generation of precious metals is, number one, the analogy is much more clear. And number two, the economic function of precious metals is also pretty well understood. And historically, a lot of precious metals have been used as a check against inflation, and also as a check against boom bust cycles. And if you kind of like, I don't know, rewind back to everything that we talked about in this presentation, rules versus discretion, right? Inside versus outside money, the virtues of a synthetic commodity money, Truffins dilemma. It really, really comes down to one recurring theme, which is that we should fear boom and bust cycles. That's something that, even the most well-intentioned policymakers using the best instruments of our time, with the best knowledge of our time, have not been able to stave off. And we are facing a scenario with increased globalization where, the ecosystem is very highly interconnected. And as a result, these boom bust cycles can get much more devastating. And one of the cool things about cryptocurrencies that I mentioned earlier was that they have this, unique disconnect, right? There is no direct connection to indicators of consumption and production, right? Bitcoin doesn't really care about GDP growth rates. It doesn't care about the cost of labor. It doesn't care about, employment. It just exists, and it allows you to transact, and it has a fixed supply. And as a result of that, it's had this very kind of random, almost like, super random movement pattern, for the past 10 years or so. It hasn't really had a great deal of risk exposure to equities and precious metals and commodities. And I guess in the last year or so, we've seen it lock in with a movement pattern, at the time of a panic sell. Of course, it's this risk asset. And of course, everybody wanted to leave risk in March, and it started to lock into a movement pattern that was similar to like S&P futures. And then for a time, it was moving a lot more like gold. And yes, these things can happen, but they don't have to happen. It's hard for me to imagine like other normal assets, like imagine Apple stock suddenly moving like gold, right? It'd be hard for that to happen because it does care about things like trade sanctions and other indicators, right? Other kind of macroeconomic factors. So Bitcoin, because it is not overtly connected to the traditional economy, can move differently, and as a result, it can take on this function as a check against boom and bust cycles. Now, it can't eliminate them, but because it's relatively uncorrelated, can diversify against them. And because it's a risk asset, it offers a slightly different kind of, profile in a portfolio than gold. It's just not as mature as gold. And I guess lastly, I kind of want to cover some of these mirage problems that I don't think can really be addressed by cryptocurrencies that I see, show up in recurring narratives from time to time. And they all seem to be connected to this idea that there might exist a direct connection between money and government, right? So if you're angry with things like the US dollar, right, we know the Fed mandate, right? It's, maintain a certain level of employment, maintain a certain type of interest, long-term interest rate, maintain a certain amount of price inflation. And what that ultimately suggests is that if you're unhappy with the status of your employment, you can blame the US dollar, you can blame the Fed, you can blame the government, right? If you feel like prices are suddenly falling too quickly or rising too quickly, you can actually blame the Fed for that. But that's because we exist in a system today where there is a direct connection between money and government. You wouldn't be able to blame something like gold for not having, the job that you want, or the prices that you want, right? Or the tax policy that you want. And so it's interesting. It's almost like just this word money itself being nebulously defined gives rise to a lot of mirage problems and mirage solutions that I don't think can really be addressed by cryptocurrencies. So a lot of folks talk about creating new virtual nation states, or, different type of, Federal Reserve on the blockchain. And I don't think that really speaks to the real opportunity here. But I mean, I think we're running up on time, so I'm going to just wrap with that and
Cool.
open it up to questions.
So we actually do not have time for questions because we need to transition to our next talk. But Evan, if you want to drop in your Twitter handle, people can ask you more questions.
Okay. I will do that in the chat, and thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, no worries. So our next talk will be a central banker from Singapore who will be talking about CBDCs, which is very relevant right now. So join us. And thank you so much for this talk. It was really great. I learned a lot.